Montana Territory, 1878. The sky stretched endless above the rolling plains of the Gallatin Valley, where the promise of new beginnings masked the unforgiving nature of the frontier. This was a land where a man's worth was measured by the calluses on his hands and the straightness of his spine against unrelenting elements. For 25-year-old Bryce Hammond, the West had taught him one undeniable truth. Love was a luxury a cowboy could not afford. The late June sun beat down on Bryce's broad shoulders as he guided his horse along the fence line of the White River Ranch. His sandy brown hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck, damp with honest sweat. 3 years working this spread had earned him the position of foreman, but the title did little to fill the hollow space that seemed to expand inside him each passing season. His face, too handsome for a man who rarely smiled, remained set in the determined expression he'd cultivated since watching his father's small homestead fail after his mother's death. "No point getting attached to anything out here," he muttered to his horse, a tall chestnut gelding that had been his only constant companion. "Land takes what it wants, people leave when it gets hard." He'd seen it too many times. Young couples arriving full of hope, then broken by drought, blizzards, or the sheer isolation until one morning the woman was gone, leaving a broken man behind. Bryce had decided long ago he would never be that man. The frontier was for the hardened, the solitary. Love was a weakness that the West punished without mercy. What he wanted was simple enough: to save every dollar until he could claim his own piece of land, build a modest cabin, and live by the straightforward rules of survival. No complications, no heartbreak, just the honest relationship between a man and the earth he worked. What he needed, well, that was something he refused to consider. That evening Bryce rode back toward the main house as golden light bathed the valley. The foreman's cabin waited for him, empty, quiet, and predictable, just as he preferred it, just as it would always be. The tranquility of his planned existence shattered the following afternoon. "Riders coming," shouted young Jamie, one of the ranch hands, pointing toward the eastern horizon. Bryce squinted against the sun, making out 3 wagons and several riders approaching the ranch. Settlers weren't uncommon in these parts, but something about this caravan moved with purpose rather than the uncertain crawl of those just passing through. "Keep working," he instructed the men. "I'll see what they want." He mounted his horse and rode out to meet the travelers. As he approached, he saw the lead wagon was driven by a man in his 50s, gray-bearded and weathered. But it was the figure beside him that caused Bryce to slow his horse, a young woman with bright eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. "Afternoon," the older man called out. "Name's Josiah Burton. This here's my daughter, Clara." Clara Burton nodded politely, but there was nothing demure about her posture. At 22, she sat tall and confident on the wagon seat, her chestnut hair braided neatly away from her face. She wore a practical riding skirt of sturdy blue cotton, and her white blouse, though dusty from travel, was crisp and proper. But it was the rifle resting casually across her lap that caught Bryce's attention. "Bryce Hammond, foreman of White River Ranch," he replied, tipping his hat. "What brings you folks this way?" "We've purchased the old Miller place," Josiah explained. "Got the papers right here from the land office in Helena." Bryce felt his jaw tighten. The Miller place bordered White River Ranch to the east, 500 acres of decent grazing land with access to a year-round creek. He'd been saving to make an offer on it himself. "Miller's been gone 3 years, Bryce said. "That land's fallen into rough shape." "Nothing hard work won't fix," Clara spoke up, her voice steady and clear as a mountain stream. "We've come to stay." Something in her tone, the quiet certainty, perhaps unsettled Bryce. He'd seen plenty of women arrive in Montana Territory full of determination, only to be defeated by the isolation and hardship. This one would be no different. "Winter comes early here," he warned, unable to keep the edge from his voice. "And stays long. Many folks don't make it past their first year." Clara's eyes, the warm brown of freshly turned soil, met his directly. "We're aware of the challenges, Mr. Hammond. But I assure you, we didn't come all the way from Missouri to fail." Bryce felt an unexpected tension between them, not quite hostility, but a mutual assessment. He broke eye contact first, turning to her father. "Your property starts about 3 miles east. Follow the creek and you'll come to what's left of the cabin. It's not much." "We appreciate the direction," Josiah said, extending his hand. "Hope we can be good neighbors." Bryce shook it briefly. "Just keep your stock off White River grass and we'll get along fine." As they prepared to continue their journey, Clara spoke again. "Mr. Hammond, is there a doctor nearby? One of our party is expecting, and I'd like to know where to find help if needed." The mention of a birth, new life coming to this hard country struck Bryce as foolish optimism. Doc Wilson's in Bozeman. 3 days' ride in good weather. Clara nodded, digesting this information without visible alarm. "Thank you, we'll manage." As the wagons pulled away, Bryce watched Clara Burton's straight back and couldn't help but feel a twinge of something unexpected, respect perhaps, mixed with concern. She hadn't flinched at his warnings, and that bothered him more than he cared to admit. 3 weeks passed before Bryce had reason to think about the Burtons again. He was inspecting a section of fence when gunshots echoed from the direction of the Miller, now Burton property. His first instinct was to ignore it. Whatever trouble they'd found wasn't his concern. But when the shooting continued, followed by the distinctive bellow of cattle in distress, he cursed under his breath and turned his horse eastward. He found chaos at the Burton homestead. A small herd of cattle scattered in panic while 3 riders attempted to control them. Near the half-rebuilt cabin, Clara Burton stood with her rifle raised, firing warning shots at 2 mounted men who were cutting out calves from the herd. Cattle rustlers, they'd become bolder since the winter, targeting smaller spreads that couldn't afford enough hands for protection. Without conscious thought, Bryce spurred his horse forward, drawing his revolver as he rode. One of the rustlers spotted him and shouted a warning to his partner. They abandoned their effort, wheeling their horses around and firing wild shots as they retreated. Bryce pulled up beside Clara, who was already reloading her rifle. "Where's your father?" he demanded. "Bozeman," she replied, her hands steady as she worked. "Went for supplies and to find hired help." "You've been here alone," the thought struck him as both foolish and impressive. "Me and the Peterson family in the second wagon. Mr. Peterson's down with fever, so it's just me and Mrs. Peterson who can shoot." She nodded toward the cabin, where a pregnant woman stood in the doorway with a shotgun. Bryce hesitated only a moment before making a decision he knew he might regret. "Round up what cattle you can. You'll bring them to White River until your father returns." Clara lowered her rifle, studying him with that direct gaze that seemed to see more than he wanted to show. "Why would you help us?" The question caught him off guard, because decent men didn't let women face rustlers alone. Because he'd been raised to offer aid to neighbors, even ones he'd rather keep at a distance. Because something in her quiet strength demanded respect. "Rustlers hit you today, they could hit us tomorrow," he said finally. "Better to deal with the problem now." She nodded once, accepting his explanation without pressing further. "I'll get the wagon hitched for Mrs. Peterson." Over the next hour, Bryce helped Clara gather the scattered cattle, barely 30 head, a modest start for a new ranch. He watched with growing amazement as she worked her horse with the skill of someone born to the saddle, calling commands to her dog with the confidence of a seasoned rancher. This was no city girl playing at frontier life. As they drove the cattle toward White River, Bryce found himself riding alongside the wagon where Mrs. Peterson sat, her hands resting on her swollen belly. "You folks picked a hard place to start over," he commented. Mrs. Peterson, a fair-haired woman perhaps a few years older than Clara, offered a tired smile. "Clara didn't give us much choice. When she sets her mind, there's no changing it. She's the reason you came west." Her father wanted to start fresh after Clara's mother passed, but it was Clara who chose Montana. Said she wanted sky big enough to breathe under. Mrs. Peterson's voice held affection. "Been like a sister to me since we were girls. When she said she was heading west, Robert and I decided to come along." Bryce glanced ahead where Clara rode point on the small herd, her back straight, her braids swinging with the movement of her horse. "She's not what I expected," he admitted. Mrs. Peterson laughed softly. "Clara never is, Mr. Hammond. That's her gift to the world." At White River, Bryce directed Clara to pen her cattle in a separate pasture and installed the Petersons in a small, unused cabin near the bunkhouse. He introduced Clara to his ranch hands, noting with satisfaction that they treated her with the same respect they'd show any neighboring rancher, though he didn't miss the appreciative glances from the younger men. That evening, after ensuring the Petersons were settled, Bryce found Clara at the corral, checking her horse for any injuries from the day's hard riding. "Your cattle should be safe here," he said, leaning against the fence. "I've sent word to the other ranches about the rustlers." Clara nodded, running her hands down her horse's legs with practiced care. I appreciate your help today, Mr. Hammond. Though I admit I'm surprised by it, given your welcome 3 weeks ago. Her frankness was refreshing, if uncomfortable. I wasn't welcoming because I've seen too many people come to Montana with dreams bigger than their experience. And you've decided that's what we are. Her voice remained level, but he heard the challenge in it. I've decided I don't know what you are, Mrs. Burton. Miss, she corrected, and perhaps that's the first sensible thing you've said to me. She straightened, meeting his eyes in the fading light. I may not have been born to this territory, Mr. Hammond, but I wasn't born yesterday either. My father raised me on horseback after my mother died, and I've been helping manage our farm since I was 14. Bryce found himself wanting to believe her, which was dangerous. Hope was the first step toward disappointment out here. One summer doesn't make a Montanan, he said. It's the winters that tell the truth. To his surprise, Clara smiled. Not the defensive gesture he expected, but something genuine that transformed her face from merely pretty to striking. Then I look forward to proving myself when the snow flies. She patted her horse and moved toward the gate. Now, if you'll excuse me, I should check on Sarah. The baby's not due for a month, but the excitement today wasn't good for her. Bryce watched her walk away, struck by the uncomfortable realization that Clara Burton was not someone he could easily dismiss or forget. The following days established an uneasy routine. Each morning, Bryce found Clara already at work, helping the recovering Mr. Peterson mend harnesses, tending to her cattle, or assisting the ranch cook with bread making. She never complained, never asked for special treatment, and slowly began winning over the ranch hands with her willingness to work alongside them. One evening, a week after her arrival, Bryce found her sitting alone on the porch of the small cabin, writing in a journal by lantern light. "Mind some company?" he asked, surprising himself with the request. She looked up, equally surprised, but gestured to the empty chair beside her. "Please." He sat, suddenly uncertain why he'd sought her out. They sat in silence for a moment before Clara closed her journal. "Sarah says her father sent a telegram from Bozeman. He's found 2 hands willing to work for us and should return within the week." "Good news," Bryce nodded, though part of him had grown accustomed to seeing her around the ranch. "You'll want to get back to rebuilding before summer ends." "The cabin needs a new roof and proper windows before winter," she agreed, "and we need to put up enough hay for the cattle." "It's a lot for a small crew," he said, unable to keep the doubt from his voice. Clara turned to face him, her profile illuminated by the soft lantern light. "Why are you so certain we'll fail, Mr. Hammond?" The directness of her question demanded honesty. "Because I've seen what happens to people who come here with nothing but hope. The land takes it from them, piece by piece, until there's nothing left." "Is that what happened to you?" Her voice had softened. Bryce stared out at the darkened ranch yard, memories surfacing that he usually kept buried. "My parents had a small homestead in Colorado. When my mother died of fever, my father lost his will to fight. The drought took our crops, then the bank took our land. He drank himself to death within a year." Clara was quiet for a long moment. "I'm sorry." "Truly. It's the way of things out here," he said, the old bitterness rising. "The frontier doesn't care about your dreams or your heart. It only respects strength and endurance." "I don't disagree," Clara said, surprising him. "But perhaps you're mistaking hope for naivety, Mr. Hammond. Hope isn't blind faith that everything will work out. It's the courage to try even when you know the odds." Her words unsettled him, challenging beliefs he'd held as gospel for years. "And if you fail?" She looked at him directly, her eyes reflecting the lantern flame. "Then I fail knowing I gave everything. But I won't fail, Mr. Hammond. I can't afford to." Something in her tone suggested deeper currents than mere determination. Before he could respond, Sarah Peterson called from inside the cabin, and Clara rose immediately. "Good night, Mr. Hammond," she said, gathering her journal. "Bryce," he said impulsively. "If we're to be neighbors, you might as well use my name." She paused at the door, a small smile touching her lips. "Good night, Bryce." As he walked back to his cabin, Bryce realized with uncomfortable clarity that Clara Burton had begun to occupy his thoughts in ways that went beyond neighborly concern. Her quiet competence, her directness, even her stubborn determination, all had begun to form a picture of a woman unlike any he'd known before, and that was precisely why he needed to maintain his distance once she returned to her own land. 2 days later, a summer storm rolled in from the mountains, bringing driving rain and wind that bent the prairie grass horizontal. Bryce was returning from checking on the herd when a flash of movement caught his eye. Clara was struggling to secure a tarp over the Petersons' wagon, which still contained many of their possessions. The wind threatened to tear it from her hands with each gust. He rode over, dismounting quickly to help. Together they managed to tie down the canvas, rainwater streaming from their hats and soaking their clothes. "You should get inside," he shouted over the wind. "The calves," she called back. "2 were born just yesterday. They're in the south pen with their mothers, but there's no shelter." Without discussion, they both headed for the pen. The newborn calves were indeed struggling, their mothers attempting to shield them from the worst of the weather. Working together, Bryce and Clara herded the pairs into a small equipment shed, the only available shelter nearby. Inside, relatively protected from the downpour, Bryce became acutely aware of Clara standing beside him. Water dripped from her sodden clothes, her hair had come loose from its practical braid, and her white blouse clung to her slender frame in a way that made him quickly avert his eyes. "Here," he said gruffly, removing his canvas coat and handing it to her. "I'm fine," she protested. "You're shivering," he countered. After a moment's hesitation, she accepted the coat, wrapping it around her shoulders. It engulfed her smaller frame but seemed to help immediately. "Thank you," she said, her voice softer than he'd heard before, "for the coat and for helping with the calves." "Those calves represent your future," he said simply. "Can't let a storm wash that away." They stood in companionable silence, watching the rain pound against the small window of the shed. The cows had settled with their calves in the clean straw, seemingly content with their temporary shelter. "This is why I came west," Clara said suddenly. "For rainstorms and soggy cattle?" Bryce asked, a rare smile tugging at his lips. She laughed, a sound that seemed to brighten the dim shed, for the rawness of it. "Back in Missouri, everything felt confined. My father's farm was good land, but it was hemmed in by neighbors and expectations. After my mother died, the town had very specific ideas about what my life should be." "And what was that?" "Marriage to the banker's son, a tidy house in town, children, church socials, a perfectly respectable life." She shook her head. "But every time I thought about it, I felt like I couldn't breathe." Bryce studied her profile, understanding dawning. "So you convinced your father to sell up and head west?" "It wasn't hard. He'd been restless too, ever since we lost Mother." She turned to face him. "People think women come west following men and their dreams, but sometimes we have dreams of our own." "And what's your dream, Clara?" The question came out softer than he intended. "To build something that's truly mine, a place where I answer to the land and the seasons, but not to anyone's notion of what a woman should be or want." She gestured to the calves. "To see life grow from my own efforts." Her words resonated with an honesty that struck a chord in Bryce. It wasn't so different from what he wanted himself: freedom, self-reliance, the dignity of creation rather than mere survival. Yet he'd never considered that a woman might hunger for the same independence. The storm began to ease, the drumming on the roof softening to a gentle patter. Clara moved toward the door, but Bryce caught her arm gently. "Wait," he said. "There's something I should tell you." She looked up at him, questioning. "I was saving to buy the Miller place myself. That's why I wasn't welcoming when you arrived. It felt like you'd taken something I'd been working toward." Confusion crossed her face, followed by understanding. "I didn't know." "How could you?" He released her arm, suddenly self-conscious. "I just wanted you to know it wasn't about you." "Thank you for telling me," she said. "Does this mean we might actually become friends, Bryce Hammond?" The teasing lilt in her voice made something warm unfurl in his chest. "I suppose stranger things have happened in Montana territory." Her smile was worth the admission. When Clara's father returned with 2 hired hands 3 days later, Bryce found himself unexpectedly reluctant to see her go. Josiah Burton proved to be a straightforward man with a firm handshake and genuine gratitude for White River's hospitality. "We won't forget this, Hammond," he said as they prepared to depart. "You need anything, you just send word." Bryce nodded, his eyes drifting to where Clara was helping Sarah Peterson into the wagon. "Just being neighborly." Josiah followed his gaze, a knowing look crossing his weathered face. Clara's got her mother's spirit, too much for most men to handle. Before Bryce could formulate a response to this unexpected observation, Clara approached. "We're ready, Pa," she said, then turned to Bryce. "I'll return your coat once I've had a chance to clean and press it properly." "No hurry," he replied, suddenly aware of Josiah's interested gaze. Clara extended her hand. "Thank you again, Bryce, for everything." He took her hand, noting the strength in her grip. "You folks need anything, White River's just a ride away." Something passed between them in that moment, an acknowledgement, perhaps, that the barriers he'd erected at their first meeting had begun to crumble. She smiled, squeezed his hand once, then turned away to mount her horse. Bryce watched until the small procession disappeared over the eastern ridge, telling himself the hollow feeling in his chest was merely the quiet that followed a busy week. Nothing more. July melted into August, bringing the relentless work of haying season. Bryce threw himself into the familiar rhythm of long days, driving himself and his men to cut, rake, and stack the winter feed that would determine the ranch's survival in the months ahead. If his thoughts sometimes strayed to the neighboring homestead, he disciplined them back to the task at hand. News came intermittently through passing riders or trips to town. The Burtons were making progress, it seemed. They'd repaired the cabin roof and dug a new well. Clara had proven to have a good eye for cattle, trading a wagon and tools for 4 more breeding cows from a rancher heading back east. Each report brought a mixture of admiration and concern to Bryce. Admiration for their industry, concern for the approaching winter. The old-timers in Bozeman were predicting a harsh one, pointing to the thick fur on rabbits and the early migrations of geese. It was late August when the opportunity, or excuse, to visit the Burton place finally presented itself. A letter arrived from the territorial governor's office, warning of increased Indian activity along the northern reaches of the valley. While not an immediate threat to established ranches, outlying homesteads were advised to be vigilant. Bryce saddled his horse the same afternoon, telling himself it was simply responsible neighborliness that prompted his journey. The 5-mile ride to the Burton homestead gave him time to compose what he would say, though the carefully planned words fled his mind when the cabin came into view. The transformation was remarkable. What had been a dilapidated shell was now a proper home, with new shingles, glass windows, and a sturdy fence enclosing a small vegetable garden. Smoke curled from the chimney, and the sounds of activity carried on the warm air. Clara emerged from a small barn as he approached, a basket of eggs in her hands. She wore a simple dress of faded blue cotton, her hair braided and wrapped around her head in a practical crown. The sight of her healthy, vibrant, clearly in her element, caused an unexpected tightness in Bryce's chest. "Bryce," she called, setting down her basket and wiping her hands on her apron, "what brings you our way?" He dismounted, suddenly feeling foolish with his official warning. Territorial office sent word about increased Blackfoot activity to the north. Nothing to panic about, but thought you should know. She nodded, her expression turning serious. "We've heard the same from a trader who passed through yesterday. Pa's taken to keeping the rifle loaded." Bryce glanced around the homestead, noting the improvements but also the vulnerabilities. "Your place is looking good, but it's still isolated. If there's trouble, you might not be able to get word out. Would you like to come in? Pa's gone to help the Petersons with their place a mile over, but I can offer you coffee." The invitation was casual, but Bryce detected a hint of something more, perhaps hope, in her voice. Against his better judgment, he nodded. The cabin interior was modest but surprisingly homey. Curtains made from flour sacks framed the windows, a hand-braided rug covered part of the plank floor, and wildflowers stood in a jar on the table. It struck Bryce that this was more than shelter. Clara had created a home. She busied herself at the stove while Bryce removed his hat, feeling strangely out of place. His own cabin, functional but stark, suddenly seemed empty by comparison. "How's the haying coming at White River?" she asked, setting a cup of coffee before him. "Nearly finished," he replied, grateful for the neutral topic. "Looks to be a good yield this year. We've put up what we can, but it's our first season on this land." She sat across from him, her own cup between her hands. "I worry it won't be enough if winter comes early." Her admission of vulnerability surprised him. "You could buy extra from Sanderson's place if needed. He usually has surplus to sell." She nodded thoughtfully. "That's good to know." She hesitated, then added, "I wanted to thank you again for your help when we arrived. I'm not sure we would have gotten this far without it." "You would have," Bryce said with certainty. "You're determined enough." A smile touched her lips. "Is that a compliment, Bryce Hammond?" "Just an observation," he replied. though he couldn't help returning her smile. "You've done good work here, Clara, better than most would manage in a first season." Her expression softened. "That means something coming from you." The moment stretched between them, warm and unexpectedly intimate. Bryce found himself noticing details he'd missed before, the light dusting of freckles across her nose, the way her eyes crinkled slightly at the corners when she smiled, the single tendril of hair that had escaped her practical braid to curl against her neck. Abruptly he stood, uncomfortable with the direction of his thoughts. I should head back, daylight's burning. If Clara was disappointed by his sudden withdrawal, she hid it well. She walked him to his horse, maintaining a polite distance that somehow felt greater than the physical space between them. "I kept my promise," she said as he mounted. "What promise?" She smiled up at him, shielding her eyes against the afternoon sun. "I told you I wouldn't fail. I haven't." "Not yet," he said, but there was no bite in the words. "Winter's still coming. Then perhaps you'll check on us when the snow flies, to see if I'm keeping my word." There was a challenge in her tone, but something softer too, an invitation that went beyond neighborly concern. "Perhaps I will," he replied, tipping his hat before turning his horse toward home. As he rode, Bryce found himself unsettled by his own reactions. Clara Burton had begun to occupy a space in his thoughts that no woman had before. Her capability impressed him, her determination challenged him, and her quiet strength attracted him in ways he wasn't prepared to acknowledge. The frontier was no place for such feelings. He'd learned that lesson through painful experience. And yet the image of Clara standing in her doorway, building a life through sheer force of will, refused to leave him. September brought the first frost, painting the valley in silver that melted under the still warm sun. Bryce was breaking a new horse in the corral when he saw a rider approaching at speed. He recognized Mr. Peterson, his face grim with urgency. "Sarah's time has come," he announced without preamble. "The baby's coming wrong, and Clara says we need the doctor." Bryce's stomach dropped. A difficult birth on the frontier often meant death for mother, child, or both. Doc Wilson's in Bozeman. 3 days' ride. "Clara said to ask if one of your men would go. She's doing what she can, but..." The fear in the man's eyes was naked and raw. "I'll go myself," Bryce decided instantly. "My gelding's the fastest horse in the valley." He gave quick instructions to his foreman, packed minimal supplies, and was riding hard within 15 minutes. The journey to Bozeman was punishing at such speed, but Bryce pushed on through the night, changing horses at a way station and continuing without rest. He found Dr. Wilson and explained the urgency. To the doctor's credit, he asked no questions, simply packed his medical bag and accompanied Bryce on the return journey. They reached the Peterson homestead as the second day's light was fading. The small cabin seemed unnaturally quiet as they approached. Bryce felt dread building in his chest. Had they arrived too late? Clara met them at the door, her face drawn with exhaustion, her sleeves rolled up and apron-stained. For one terrible moment, Bryce thought the worst had happened. Then she smiled, the expression transforming her tired face. "You made it," she said simply. "Both of you, thank God." "The mother, the baby?" Dr. Wilson asked, already moving past her into the cabin. "Both alive, but it was close," Clara replied. "The baby came feet first, but I remembered something my mother once did as a midwife. I managed to turn him." Bryce stood frozen, absorbing what she was saying. Clara had delivered a breech birth alone, saving both mother and child through knowledge and courage most trained physicians would envy. Dr. Wilson emerged an hour later, his face showing professional respect. "You did fine work, Miss Burton. That mother and child would both be dead without your intervention." Clara shook her head modestly. "I only did what was necessary until you could arrive." "You did what many doctors couldn't," the older man corrected. "If you ever want training as a proper midwife, you come see me in Bozeman." After the doctor had checked both patients and declared them stable, he accepted Josiah Burton's offer of a bed for the night. Clara finally stepped outside, where Bryce had been waiting in the growing darkness. "You rode to Bozeman and back in 2 days," she said, the wonder evident in her voice. "Any of the hands would have done the same," he replied, uncomfortable with her gratitude. "But it was you who went." She moved closer, close enough that he could see the fatigue etched in the lines around her eyes. "Thank you, Bryce." "What you did in there," he began, struggling to find words adequate to express his admiration. I was terrified, she admitted, her composure cracking slightly. When I saw the baby's feet instead of his head, I thought I'd have to choose which one to save. Without thinking, Bryce reached out, taking her hand in his. It was small but strong, the skin roughened by honest work. But you didn't give up, you found another way. There's always another way, she said quietly. That's what my mother taught me before she died. There's always a path forward if you're brave enough to see it. In that moment, standing in the gathering darkness with her hand in his, Bryce felt something fundamental shift within him. The walls he'd built around his heart, the certainty that the frontier allowed no room for connection, began to crumble. Clara Burton had faced death and fear with the same quiet strength she brought to everything, not by denying the reality of frontier hardship, but by meeting it with unflinching courage. Before he could speak, Josiah called from the cabin, and Clara squeezed his hand once before letting go. You should rest, she said. You've ridden hard for 2 days. Clara, he said, her name feeling different on his tongue now, weighted with meaning he wasn't ready to examine. What you did was remarkable. She smiled, a genuine smile despite her exhaustion. So was what you did, Bryce Hammond. As he watched her return to the cabin, Bryce realized with sudden clarity that Clara Burton had become more than a neighbor, more than a friend. She had become a possibility he had never allowed himself to consider. October painted the valley in gold and crimson as the aspens turned and the prairie grasses ripened to wheat-colored waves. The first snows dusted the distant mountains, a reminder of what was coming. Bryce found reasons to ride to the Burton place more frequently, bringing news, offering help with winter preparations, checking on the new mother and child. Each visit deepened his understanding of Clara. He saw how she managed the small homestead with quiet efficiency, how she'd earned the respect of their hired hands through knowledge rather than authority, how she brightened when speaking of her plans for spring planting. He noticed, too, the approving glances Josiah cast in his direction, and the way the older man found reasons to leave them alone together. On a crisp afternoon in late October, Bryce helped Clara repair a section of corral fence damaged in a recent windstorm. They worked in comfortable silence for a time, the rhythm of their hammers creating a steady counterpoint. I've been thinking, Clara said eventually, pausing to wipe her brow. About what you said when we first met, about people not making it through their first winter here. Bryce felt a pang of regret for his earlier dismissiveness. You've proven me wrong on that score. No, she said, surprising him. You were right to warn us. The frontier doesn't forgive unpreparedness. But I think perhaps you were wrong about why people fail here. She set down her hammer, giving him her full attention. You believe people fail because they bring hope to a place that demands only strength. I've come to think people fail because they try to face this land alone. The insight struck Bryce with unexpected force. Wasn't that exactly what he'd been doing for years? Facing the frontier's challenges through solitary determination, believing connection was a liability rather than strength. The settlers who survive aren't just the strongest, Clara continued. They're the ones who build communities, who understand that some burdens are too heavy for one person to carry. Like a breech birth, Bryce said quietly. Like a breech birth, she agreed. Or a blizzard or rustlers, or the 100 other challenges this land throws at us. She picked up her hammer again, resuming her work. I came west seeking independence, Bryce, but I've learned that independence doesn't mean isolation. It means choosing your connections carefully, building relationships that strengthen rather than diminish. Her words resonated with a truth Bryce had been approaching himself, through his growing feelings for her. You're wiser than your years, Clara Burton. She laughed, the sound bright in the autumn air. Not wisdom, just observation, and perhaps a willingness to learn what the land is actually teaching, not just what I expect to hear. As they finished the fence repairs, Bryce found himself watching Clara, the confidence in her movements, the intelligence in her eyes, the quiet joy she took in building something lasting. In that moment, he recognized what had been growing in him since that first day at White River Ranch, not just admiration or attraction, but a deep respect that had blossomed into something he had never expected to feel again. Something he had convinced himself had no place in the life he'd chosen. Love, as unexpected as a spring flower pushing through snow, the revelation should have terrified him. Instead, it filled him with a strange certainty, as if he'd finally recognized a truth that had been waiting patiently for him to see it. When they finished working, Clara invited him inside for coffee. The cabin had evolved further since his first visit, with shelves of preserved foods lining one wall and a small bookshelf in the corner. It felt lived in now, a true home rather than merely shelter. "You've done well here," he said, accepting the cup she offered. "We're still learning," she replied, settling across from him at the table. "Each day brings new challenges. The first snow will come soon," he noted. "The real test begins then." Clara studied him over the rim of her cup. "You're still waiting for us to fail, aren't you?" The question wasn't accusatory, merely curious. Bryce considered it honestly. "No," he said finally, "not anymore, but old habits of thinking die hard." "Which habits are those?" "That the frontier punishes connection. That caring for someone makes you vulnerable in ways that can destroy you." The words hung between them, more revealing than he'd intended. Clara set down her cup, her expression thoughtful. "My mother used to say that a heart that hasn't been broken is a heart that hasn't truly lived," she said softly. "I think perhaps the frontier doesn't punish connection, Bryce. It simply demands that our connections be as strong and resilient as everything else in our lives must be." "And if they aren't," he asked, his voice lower than he intended, "then we rebuild," she said simply. "Just as we rebuild fences after storms or cabins after fire, we salvage what remains and start again." Her philosophy, practical yet profoundly hopeful, moved him. Before he could respond, the door opened and Josiah entered, stomping snow from his boots. "Storm's coming," he announced. "Sky's turning that funny gray-green to the north." Bryce rose immediately, recognizing the description of an approaching blizzard. "I should get back to White River." Clara walked him to his horse, concern evident in her eyes. "Be careful, Bryce, these early storms can be treacherous." "I've weathered worse," he assured her, though the sky indeed looked ominous. She laid a hand on his arm. "Promise you'll stay at the line cabin if it gets too bad to continue. I couldn't bear it if—" She stopped, seeming surprised by her own vehemence. Something warm unfurled in Bryce's chest at her concern. "I promise," he said, covering her hand with his own. "Take care of yourself, Clara Burton. I'll check on you when the storm passes." The weather deteriorated rapidly as Bryce rode, visibility decreasing with each passing mile. By the time he reached White River, the first heavy snowflakes were falling, driven horizontally by a bitter wind. He spent the evening helping secure the ranch for the coming storm, all the while thinking of Clara and hoping the Burton homestead was equally prepared. The blizzard raged for 3 days, burying the valley under feet of snow and driving temperatures well below freezing. When it finally cleared, revealing a transformed landscape of pristine white, Bryce's first thought was of the Burtons. "I'm riding to check on the neighboring homesteads," he informed his foreman. "Some of these new settlers won't have experienced a Montana blizzard before." He packed supplies, coffee, flour, bacon, and medicines, before setting out. The journey was slow, his horse laboring through drifts that sometimes reached its chest. By mid-afternoon, he crested the final rise that would bring the Burton homestead into view. What he saw made his heart stutter. Smoke rose from the chimney, but half the roof of the barn had collapsed under the snow's weight. As he approached, he saw Clara and Josiah working frantically to free cattle trapped in the structure. Dismounting quickly, Bryce waded through the snow to help. Together, they managed to extract the remaining animals, moving them to the relative shelter of a lean-to attached to the cabin. "Lost 2 calves," Josiah said grimly when the work was done. "Would have lost more if Clara hadn't heard the roof starting to give way in the night." Bryce turned to Clara, noting the exhaustion in her face and the determination that overrode it. "Are you all right?" "We'll rebuild," she said simply, though he could see the toll the disaster had taken. The important thing is most of the cattle survived. Her resilience in the face of setback struck Bryce anew. This was the true test of frontier character, not whether one avoided hardship, but how one responded to it. Inside the cabin, Clara prepared hot coffee while Josiah examined the supplies Bryce had brought. "Thoughtful of you," the older man said. "We're well stocked, but these medicines will come in handy." "White River looks after its neighbors," Bryce replied, though they all knew his concern went beyond mere neighborliness. When Josiah stepped outside to check on the cattle again, Bryce moved to where Clara stood by the stove, her shoulders slumped with fatigue now that her father was gone. "You've been working since the barn collapsed, haven't you?" he asked gently. "Without rest." She nodded, too tired to maintain her usual composure. I couldn't let them die, Bryce. They're our future. Without thinking, he reached out, drawing her into his arms. She resisted for only a moment before leaning into him, her head resting against his chest. He felt her shudder once, then grow still, accepting the comfort he offered. You did everything possible, he murmured into her hair. No one could have done more. They stood that way for several minutes, a moment of shared vulnerability that felt more intimate than any words could have been. When Clara finally pulled away, her eyes were dry but soft with emotion. Thank you, she said simply, for coming to check on us, for helping. I was worried about you, he admitted. When I saw the barn. We'll rebuild, she repeated, her natural determination reasserting itself. It's what we do out here, isn't it? Face what comes and rebuild. Yes, Bryce agreed, suddenly certain of what he needed to say. Clara, The door opened as Josiah returned, and the moment for confession passed. But something had changed between them, a boundary crossed, an understanding reached without words. As Bryce prepared to leave, promising to return with men to help rebuild the barn, Clara walked him to his horse. The storm wasn't what I expected, she admitted quietly. It was humbling. Nature has a way of reminding us of our place, Bryce replied, but you faced it, you didn't break. Neither did you, she said, looking up at him with an expression that made his heart race. When we first met, you warned me about winter, said it would tell the truth about whether I belonged here. I was wrong, he said, meeting her gaze directly. You belong here, Clara Burton. As much as anyone I've ever known. The smile that bloomed on her face was like sunrise after the longest night. I'll hold you to that judgment, Bryce Hammond. As he rode away, Bryce felt a certainty growing within him. Clara Burton had faced the frontier's harshest test and emerged stronger, her spirit intact. She had proven not just her resilience, but her capacity to meet adversity with grace and determination. And in doing so, she had shown him a truth he had been running from for years. That true strength came not from isolation, but from the courage to remain open despite knowing the risks. That a heart which had found a home was not weakened, but fortified. The next weeks brought a rhythm of rebuilding. True to his word, Bryce returned with men and materials to help construct a new barn, stronger than the first. The work brought the two homesteads closer, creating bonds of mutual support that extended beyond Clara and Bryce to include the ranch hands and hired men. As December settled over the valley, bringing shortened days and crystal-clear nights, Bryce found himself riding to the Burton place nearly every evening he could spare. Sometimes they simply shared coffee and conversation by the fire. Other times they worked side by side on small projects around the homestead. Always, there was a deepening connection that neither spoke of directly, but both acknowledged through glances and small touches. On Christmas Eve, the Burtons invited the entire White River crew for dinner, transforming their modest cabin into a haven of warmth and light. Sarah Peterson brought her healthy infant son, now named Wilson after the doctor who had arrived too late to help, but in time to save her recovery. The celebration was simple but heartfelt, a testament to community forged through shared experience. As the evening wound down and the ranch hands departed, Bryce lingered, helping Clara clear away the remnants of the meal. Josiah, with a knowing smile, announced he was retiring early, leaving them alone by the fire. Your first Montana Christmas, Bryce observed, watching the flames cast golden light across Clara's features. Different from Missouri, I expect. Colder, she agreed with a smile, but warmer in other ways. He understood her meaning. Despite the harsh environment, despite the challenges they'd faced, there was a warmth in what they'd built together, not just structures but connections. I have something for you, he said, reaching into his coat pocket. Not much of a Christmas gift, but... He handed her a small wooden box. Clara opened it carefully to reveal a silver locket, simple but elegant. Bryce, she breathed, it's beautiful. Open it, he urged. Inside was a tiny sprig of sagebrush, preserved and pressed. Clara looked up, questioning. It's from the day we met, he explained, when I was so certain you wouldn't last and you were so determined to prove me wrong. Her fingers traced the delicate silver. You kept this all this time. I didn't know why then, he admitted, but I think I was marking the day something changed, even if I wasn't ready to recognize it. Clara closed the locket, holding it tight in her palm. What changed, Bryce? The moment had come for honesty. Bryce took a deep breath, gathering courage. My understanding of strength, he said. All these years, I thought strength meant standing alone against whatever came. Building walls high enough that nothing could touch me. He moved closer, taking her free hand in his. But you showed me a different kind of strength, Clara, the courage to remain open despite knowing the cost. The wisdom to understand that connections don't make us vulnerable, they make us whole. Clara's eyes shone in the firelight, and what does that mean for us? It means I love you, Bryce said simply, the words feeling right and true. Not despite the challenges we face out here, but because of how you meet them, with grace and determination and that remarkable spirit that saw possibility where I saw only hardship. Clara's breath caught. I never expected to find you here, she whispered, a man who could see me as I am and value it, who would understand why I needed this life, this freedom. I didn't expect you either, he admitted with a smile, a woman strong enough to tame both the frontier and a man who'd forgotten how to hope. She moved into his arms then, her head fitting perfectly against his shoulder. I love you too, Bryce Hammond, for seeing my strength when others saw only a woman who didn't know her place. When their lips met, it felt like coming home, not to a place, but to a truth both had been seeking. That love wasn't a weakness on the frontier, it was the foundation that made survival meaningful. Spring came slowly to Montana territory, as it always did, a grudging retreat of snow followed by mud season, then the miracle of green returning to the valley. On the first truly warm day of May, Bryce and Clara stood together on a ridge overlooking both their properties. Below them, new life was evident everywhere, calves frolicking in green pastures, fresh timber framing an addition to the Burton cabin, wildflowers dotting the prairie in bursts of color. Hard to believe it's been almost a year since I first saw this place, Clara mused, her hand comfortably entwined with Bryce's. Hard to believe I almost sent you packing, he replied with a rueful smile. She laughed, the sound carrying on the spring breeze. You weren't entirely wrong to worry. It has been hard, harder than I imagined sometimes. But you never wavered, he said, his voice warm with pride and love. Neither did you, she pointed out. You could have kept your distance, protected your heart. Instead, you chose to risk everything. Bryce turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. The woman before him had transformed his understanding of what was possible on the frontier, not by rejecting its hardships, but by meeting them with unwavering courage and an open heart. Clara Burton, he said, his voice steady despite the hammering of his heart. I came west believing the frontier had no place for love. That a man had to choose between his heart and his survival. He reached into his pocket, withdrawing a simple gold band. You taught me that real strength comes from building a life that includes both. Will you marry me, Clara? Make a home with me where White River meets Burton land. Tears welled in Clara's eyes, but her smile was radiant. Yes, she said without hesitation, 1,000 times yes. As he slipped the ring onto her finger, Bryce felt the last of his old barriers dissolve. The frontier hadn't changed, it was still a place of challenge and hardship, of brutal winters and unpredictable dangers, but he had changed. Clara had changed him. He had come to understand that the most important survival skill wasn't isolation or self-reliance, but the courage to remain open to love despite knowing its risks. That the heart, when it found its true home, wasn't weakened but fortified against whatever storms might come. I've been thinking, Clara said as they began walking back toward the homestead, her hands secure in his. About what my mother used to say, that there's always a path forward if you're brave enough to see it. And what path do you see now? Bryce asked, content in a way he had never imagined possible. Clara's eyes, bright with love and the promise of their future, met his. One we walk together, through whatever comes. As the spring sun warmed the Montana earth around them, Bryce knew with bone-deep certainty that they would face whatever challenges arose, not as two separate souls fighting individual battles, but as partners whose strength was multiplied by their connection. The frontier hadn't changed, but love had changed them, and in that transformation lay a truth as enduring as the mountains that watched over their valley, that even in the wildest places, hearts could find their way home.